The era of EVs, are we already there? Well, good morning everybody. Before I start this speech, I'd like to express my solidarity and sympathy with the Ukrainian people who are going through untold horror right now, and my thoughts are firmly with them. It's my pleasure to be speaking with you today. The aim of this conference is to answer the question, are we already in the era of EVs? My answer to that question is an unequivocal, undeniable yes. Not only are we already in the era of EVs, we're at the most challenging stage of it. What happens over the coming months and years will shape an entire generation of the automotive sector. I truly believe this will be the era of innovation that utterly determines the future of transport, the automotive sector, and depending on the scale and success of the innovation, could transform our planet immeasurably for the better. Right now is the most challengeable and exciting period in mobility since the horse gave way to the cart. Today I'm going to talk to you about the learnings from the established auto industry and that can be applied in this new era of electric vehicles. The move that the industry is making towards carbon neutrality is one of such magnitude that we are, for the first time in many decades, seeing new players entering and indeed dominating the field, and new expectations are being set by the consumer. Whilst from the outside it may look like some of that change is being driven by external factors such as governments, I'd argue that actually a lot of that change is being driven from within the industry itself. Before I get into the bulk of my thesis, I always think it's useful to understand how someone's thoughts have been shaped and moulded throughout the years. So I'd spend a little bit of time, a few minutes, just to introduce myself. My journey in the industry began in earnest at the age of 16 when I started as an apprentice at Automotive Products in Leamington Spa, UK. While I proved myself as an engineer at Automotive Products, it was Nissan that made me into the executive and the person that I am today. I started out at Nissan in 1991 as a manager in business administration. After a journey that saw me living in the United Kingdom, Spain, and indeed 13 years in Japan, I became executive vice president in 2011, before culminating in my appointment as chief planning officer and chief operations officer, where I became the architect for the Nissan Leaf. We truly did some great things at Nissan. In particular, I'm most proud of forging a new niche in the industry with the first electric car that sold en masse. Development of the Leaf started 15 years ago and was established as a response to Toyota's successful hybrid, the Prius. But instead of going toe-to-toe with Toyota and creating a hybrid of our own, we took the bold move of developing a car that was fully electric. The response from the rest of the industry verged on the edge of ridicule. I distinctly remember one executive from a competitor telling me that we were better off throwing a $4 billion check into the Pacific. After more than 2 decades at Nissan, I moved to Aston Martin, where I fulfilled a long dream of becoming CEO of a major car company. Today, I'm the executive vice chairman and CEO of Switch Mobility, an electric bus and van company that recently exceeded the $1 billion valuation mark to become a unicorn. The company is a subsidiary of Ashok Leyland and is spearheading the group's foray into electrification, being the world's first net zero carbon automotive company. I'm also engaged as Vice Chairman of Innobat, a European manufacturer leading the way in developing EV battery technologies, the Chairman of Hilo, a startup in the EV scooter space, as well as advising and supporting a number of businesses as they all push forward to a net zero future. So now we're acquainted, let me take you back to my years at Nissan, perhaps the very beginning of the modern EV era that we're living through right now. When I began developing the Leaf, it was the first generation of advanced batteries used in the vehicle. Back then we used lithium manganese oxide. Today the batteries found in Leaf are nickel manganese cobalt, a much more efficient and effective battery that both lasts longer as well as charges faster. Other manufacturers have opted for lithium iron phosphate batteries, particularly in those earlier days, batteries that come at a lower cost but also a lower energy density. With that being said, the cost of batteries nowadays is reducing significantly at the same time as efficiency is improving. For governments looking towards shifting from fossil fuels to electric power, this can't come soon enough. For many governments around the world, the approach seems to be to move away from subsidies and towards legislation to encourage an electric revolution. At least 9 countries, including the UK, France, Mexico and Spain, have pledged to phase out internal combustion engine vehicles altogether. Herein lies my first lesson from the past. Legislation, this is all well and good, as long as those governments know where they want to get to. Politicians around the world need to ask themselves some fundamental questions. Are we trying to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, or are we chasing cleaner air? If it's the former that we're looking to achieve, then we might want to focus a little more energy on hot hydrogen, fuel cells and synthetic fuels. If it's clean air that we're chasing, then electric vehicles are the obvious solution, as tailpipe emissions get eradicated once and for all, despite the legitimate concerns around how materials for batteries are mined and how those batteries are manufactured. I mentioned it earlier, but I want to address several governments around the world who plan to phase out internal combustion engines over the coming years. This is going to have a big and significant impact on the auto industry as we know it. What our political masters must do now is encourage competitiveness, so much so that engineers will battle it out in developing new technologies that enable us to get there. If the petrol and diesel powered combustion engines are indeed a thing of the past, then governments must not prescribe what it believes to be the replacement technology, because that will end in tears, as it always ends in tears. Politicians should define the problem and let the engineers and scientists come up with the solution. What I'm trying to say is that we shouldn't put all of our eggs into one basket. If anything, we should diversify our strategy as much as possible. As an industry, we should have a plan A, a plan B and a plan C. It is only by doing this that we can have a plan that is truly resilient to changing circumstances. That all said, we know with certainty that batteries will be a dominant source of mobility energy from now and into the foreseeable future. And that leads me to my second learning from the past, and one that I think is pertinent to India. Technology doesn't go backwards, and you can't uninvent what you already know. There is a lot of debate right now on what types of batteries should be used, particularly in India. I mentioned earlier that the Leaf transitioned from LMO to NMC chemistry. Many in the last 1 mile space looked at LFP chemistries since they are manufactured at scale in China and are thus a lower cost. This is all very well when one is purely a buyer, but in reality it is the location of the battery gigafactories that will determine the location of the future car industry. If you're going to invest, and India must invest, then invest in technology that drives you forwards and not one that ties you geopolitically to China. LFP gives you a low cost, low energy density solution, but it's with NMC and the future silicon derivatives that the industry moves towards solid state and therefore down the Moore's curve. India deserves to be a pioneer in new energy vehicles and needs to boldly innovate rather than borrow hand-me-down technologies. The decision we take over the coming years will define the next era of human advancement. Getting the economies of batteries and other net zero fuels right is not something that we can do, but something that we must do. However, doing so is far from certain and certainly won't happen seamlessly given the global challenges of the modern world. Today, I truly believe we find ourselves in the fourth iteration of the Industrial Revolution, a revolution that started through steam power. We would do well to keep in our mind the fifth iteration, and that might very well be powered by our ability to identify and develop net zero modes of transport. Getting there, however, is not a natural process. Just as we had to push our boundaries in the past, so too we have to push our boundaries in the present and in the future. Changing the world takes sweat and hard work. That revolution is currently underway, but we need to keep it going. And here is my third lesson from the past. Transport is an innate part of culture and society. Society bends to the innovations in transportation. Roads have adapted to vehicle innovations. Three-way highways, smart motorways, autonomous driving, connected cars, shared Uber mobility have all evolved around the technology of cars, buses and bikes. Do not expect that to change. The relationship between vehicle and society will evolve at a greater pace than the past. An example of that is mobility as a service. The ability to see an asset like a bus or a van as an operational cost rather than a capex asset, where you buy travel by the kilometre rather than owning the asset. India leads the way in mass for public transportation, and it's important that it continues to do so, as this is driving technology that is globally relevant. It's been my pleasure speaking with you all today. If there's one thing that I would like you to remember from this speech, it's the sense of excitement that this period right now is seeing in the automotive sector. Whatever the circumstances in which we operate, the auto industry has a proud history of changing and adapting itself, moulding around the demands of government and the expectations of customers, but always on its own terms. And that's why it's such a vibrant and exciting place to be part of right now. Unlike other changes we've had to contend with in the past, the march towards electric is stopping for no one. The EV era is as inevitable as death and tax, but we have to get it right. Thankfully, the auto industry provides us with a rich and varied history that gives us a treasure trove of learnings as we embark upon this new generation. The future is exciting. The future is bright. The future is electric. Thank you.